Hang on. What's that in your graveyard? No, you can finish in a moment. You can finish your combo. But first, I want to look at your What is that in your graveyard? I see some bones in there. I know you got... If you got bones in there and you're hiding them from me, we're going to have a problem, you and I. And I don't like it when we have problems. I'm not going to jab you. I'm not going to poke you. It's just here for show, unless you got something you shouldn't have. You don't have something you shouldn't have, do you? You're not trying to cheat, are you? You're trying to cheat me out of a nice friendly game of cards. I just want to look at what's in your graveyard. I just want to see the bones. Just show me the bones. Oh, you don't have to lie to me. I'm a friend of yours. We're friends, you and I. You can tell me if you got bones hiding around, alright? Try not to lose my temper with you, but I've seen you do this 100 times before. I know you've got something in there that you don't want me to see. Maybe I'll just check the order. Maybe I'll just see what level the monsters are in there. It's no concern of yours why I want to look in them. Show me your fucking graveyard!
Welcome to the graveyard. You would think this is where cards go when they're used up and done for, but as with most card games including this zone, it's been kind of a misnomer. Floating, reviving and banishing have all made it so that the graveyard is less akin to a place of eternal rest that you should feel guilty about recklessly sending your monsters into, and more of a graveyard. The zombie monster type has fittingly been known for various graveyard shenanigans over the years, especially during the Synchro era, leading to their notorious reputation for recovery and field swarming. However, while most zombie decks are combo or control oriented, using the graveyard as a second hand of sorts, there is an outlier whose playstyle centered around keeping as many of their monsters in the graveyard as possible before swinging for comical amounts of damage made it a fan favorite pet deck for nearly 2 decades now. The deck in question? Lights on, baby! Hit the nukes, Jesus! Skull Servants are a quaint little series of cards based around an absolutely ancient normal monster and a goofy OTK strategy that has gotten roughly one piece of support every 3 years since 2005. We're not dealing with a lot of cards here, and to even call Skull Servants an archetype by standard definition is a stretch, but it's my show where I do whatever I want. Catch you in the next episode where I rate the consistency of the Jungian archetype of the wise old man. Well, my granddad knows a lot of things, but he also kicks animals. The original Skull Servant is a level 1 zombie with 300 attack, 200 defense, and a swaggy purple cape. This might be the most basic and the oldest monster ever featured here, having been summoned in the original manga's first duel between Yugi and Kaiba before Blue Eyes White Dragon even hit the field. You've heard of Caveman Yu-Gi-Oh? Well, this is Hadean Yu-Gi-Oh! If we go any further back, we'll be talking about Burai. The flavor text here is surprisingly prescient, saying Skull Servant is not very strong, but presents real trouble in large numbers. That's cute, although if we were basing even more future support on old vanilla descriptions, we could see a Change Slimer train getting banned for FTK interactions. Also, as per usual with early TCG, there was a degree of freedom taken when translating the card's Japanese title, which in this case was simply white. Wow, that name is wrong too. It's actually vaguely greenish. Skull Servant is not a confounding localization or anything, especially compared to other stuff from the time, but it does make things a bit awkward sounding in relation to the rest of their cards, as we'll see later. In addition to that, it's a fusion material for 2 monsters that have only ever been used as targets for instant fusion, and if anybody's telling you otherwise, they're either lying or are huge fans of Dissolve Rock or Battle Warrior. Oh, okay, fine, you got me. I do love him. I mean, how can you not? He fights with his bare hands. Overall, Skull Servant is so unexceptional that it kind of wrapped around to being particularly noteworthy. Its miserable stats made it a popular joke card in the community's early days. It's featured all over artworks of generic cards in both serious and goofy contexts, and some video games even award you a special bonus for dealing the finishing blow in a duel with Skull Servant. It's pretty cool how much attention this unassuming skeleton receives just for being exactly that. Shut up, Tewart, you didn't do shit! But nothing epitomizes this underdog status quite like their first support card, and conversely most important monster, King of the Skull Servants. You see what I mean when I say the name doesn't really sound right like this? Being a quote-unquote king of servants implies he's just presiding over all the other subordinates while still being one himself. What, is he just chief of the cleaning staff at Vampire Kingdom? It's a level 1 with question mark attack and 0 defense, and the original attack of this card is the combined number of King of the Skull Servants and Skull Servant in your graveyard times 1000. When this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can banish one other King of the Skull Servants or one Skull Servant from your graveyard, special summon this card. On release, this was a tricky but fun novelty involving filling up the graveyard so that you can normal summon a level 1 with up to 5000 attack. Today, this is a tricky but fun novelty involving filling up the graveyard so that you can normal summon a level 1 with up to 23,000 attack.
Wait, What's different?
Yeah, nearly 20 years later, and the appeal in King of the Skull Servants still lies in dropping a tiny monster with a comically bloated stat line and then hoping to swing for some stupid damage. It is pretty funny that due to the way their support works by copying the Skull Servant name in the graveyard, each new monster means 3000 more attack to King in addition to all their actual effects. He's also got a piece of battle recursion, which I would have preferred with any other condition, because who is running over this? Big Inflate Dragon? There are ways to play Skull Servants without focusing on King, but to me, doing that comes off like playing Grand Maju for the rank 3 potential. I don't care for the extra deck, I'm here to smoke crack! Naturally, your game plan revolves around packing the graveyard before summoning King, which becomes marginally easier with each piece of support, although still relying heavily on outside engines, especially for discarding. Run 3 King and hope to never see a magic cylinder in your life. A few years later came the Lady in White. I guess I could believe that dress used to be white when she first sat on that chair 1000 years ago. She's a level 3 with 0 attack and 2200 defense, and says face up level 3 or lower zombie monsters on the field, except the Lady in White, cannot be destroyed by battle, also they are unaffected by spell and trap cards and effects. This card's name becomes Skull Servant while it's in the graveyard. The name sharing is a common effect with all future supports, so I'm gonna stop pointing it out after this card. But don't forget about it, or King of the Skull Servants is getting turned into bone meal. This was their first piece of protection, and it's a bit flimsy. Again, battle protection in this archetype is kind of a joke, but complete immunity from spells and traps is pretty decent, especially with this having been made in 2008, with a lot of battle traps still going around. Unfortunately, this only applies while the card is on the field, whereas you'd much prefer for it to be in the graveyard, because look at it! Any more spiders on her and she could be an insect field spell. Having one on board alongside King doesn't hurt, although it rarely happens and even more rarely provides relevant protection. However, you do run 3 of these due to the way the deck works, so just don't draw into all 3 of them, I guess. Remember to shuffle well! Next up is Whitemare. You would think the name is referring to the Beast of Darkness in the back, but the real Whitemare is that bowl-cut mustache combo. Ugh, can't escape the aristocracy even in the afterlife. It's a level 1 with 300 attack and 200 defense, and you can discard it to activate one of the following effects. Target one of your banished Skull Servant or Whitemare, return it to the graveyard, or target one of your banished the Lady in White or King of the Skull Servants, special summon it. This is a weirdly modular recovery effect, but it does make a good amount of sense. Back then, you were likely banishing stuff with Allure of Darkness, Mizuki, maybe King's Recursion effect or even Chaos monsters. Were Chaos Skull Servants a thing back then, like with Lightstorms or something? I don't know what people played back in 2010, I was watching Iron Man 2 at the mall with a classmate who had a weird last name that had us calling him the Cum Shot. Over time, the deck's playstyle has received more pieces of archetypal banishing, which only made the effect better, as the cards it returns to the graveyard are ones you would prefer to stay there, while the ones it summons are intended for the field. Don't run too many of these, but definitely keep it in mind. Around that same time, we also got Tri-White, which special summons 3 level 2 or lower normal monsters from your graveyard. Nothing that's good in Ojamas can be good in Skull Servants, so we're just gonna kick this one back into the grave. White Prince is a level 1 with 0 attack and defense, and if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can send 1 Skull Servant and 1 the Lady in White from your hand and or deck to the graveyard. You can banish 2 Skull Servants and discard from your graveyard, special summon 1 King of the Skull Servants from your deck. Although keeping in line with the odd specifications, King receives an immediate 3000 attack boost if you dump this guy by any means and let him drag his mom and dad out on a trip to the McBonals. It also lets you sacrifice that boost to fetch a King directly from the deck in case you haven't been able to put one on board, which is where Whitemare's first effect comes in handy. In most other graveyard-centric archetypes, this would be ridiculous setup potential, but it's Skull Servants, so the line of reasoning is that a little attack points never hurt anyone, so let them dump all they want.
You're gonna regret that!
Easily one of the best cards in the deck. White Princess is a level 3 light monster with 1600 attack and 0 defense, and if this card is normal or special summoned, you can send 1 White Prince from your deck to the graveyard. During either player's turn, you can send this card from your hand or field to the graveyard. All monsters currently on the field lose attack and defense equal to their own level or rank times 300 until the end of this turn. Accentuating that Prince was the deck's most versatile card at that point, Princess lets you directly send it on summon without doing anything else on the field, which is what I assume to be the reason for her being their only monster with a decent amount of original attack. That said, the deck has gotten better ways of dumping White Prince that don't take up your normal summon, but it's still appreciated to have. In addition to being an on-demand way to put a Skull Servant body in the graveyard, the second effect can make OTKs easier by axing the attack values of opponent's monsters by a couple thousand while King loses a mere 300. While I would prefer some kind of limiter removal-esque effect for even more ridiculous attack values, maybe a calcium infusion spell, having an extra bit of stat manipulation is nice as OTKs can occasionally be just out of reach. For what it's worth, she's also a light monster in case you really had that chaos variant in mind, so it's a neat card that you don't really need to run at more than 2.
Children, here's some souls for dessert. Watch for the Tempai player once they're rotten.
After that, we have what's likely one of the most delightful card arts of all time, White Baking. Enough about all that one-turn kill. All I need is one-turned grill. It's got the usual Skull 7 stats, and if a level 3 or lower zombie monster you control would be destroyed by battle or card effect, you can discard this card instead. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can add 2 monsters with different names from your deck to your hand except White Baking that are either Skull Servant or mention it, then discard 1 card. You can only use this effect of White Baking once per turn. The protection effect is pretty solid, being a non-once per turn hand trap and putting a name into the graveyard, although I would have preferred if it also prevented targeting. However, I'd often much rather remove this guy from my hand ASAP because the floating is one of the best archetypal search effects I've ever seen, giving you 2 monsters and a discard, which again would be ban-worthy in a better deck. Discard engines were already valuable to Skull Servants, but White Baking makes them basically imperative and really ups the deck's consistency a ton. This makes it the only Yu-Gi-Oh card that can simultaneously search 2 monsters and bake 2 potatoes, which is why you always run 3. And finally, I say as if we've spent a lot of time here, there's White Lord. It's another light monster with Skull Servant stats, and you can only use each of the following effects of White Lord once per turn. If you have Skull Servant or King of the Skull Servants in your graveyard, you can send this card from your hand or field to the graveyard. Send cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard! Up to the number of Skull Servant and King of the Skull Servants in your graveyard. You can banish this card from your graveyard, then target 1 Skull Servant or King of the Skull Servants in your graveyard. Special summon it. From the graveyard! The blatant Lightsworn teaming is not a coincidence, because this guy regularly lets you mill at least 7 cards, but also revives anything from the archetype in the same effect. Not only does this offer the deck unprecedented setup while being searchable and free to discard, but it also lets you run generic zombie world support and a bunch of handy floaters. King is also most likely gonna be among the cards in your graveyard, so you don't need to worry about wasting a normal summon or draining his attack with Prince. I'm content calling this the deck's most effective playmaker, as you no longer have to rely on running 60 cards and drawing into grass first turn to mill a bunch of shit, and the only complaint I have is directed at the TCG for not naming the card Whitethorn. It was white there!
This is the kind of shit white people pay for!
Grading Skull Servants is a bit of a spooky endeavor. For consistency, they're highly dependent on generic stuff like Unizombie, the Horus Engine, or really any kind of discard enabler. They can actually land on an 8000 plus attack king fairly often if we also account for that stuff, but they don't have many archetypal ways to kickstart their combos. I'd say this is a 3. Power is a funny one. If we're strictly talking max damage, this is like a 6. King frequently hits the field with at least 11,000 attack, you can have multiples of them out, and if you really go bones deep, you can even hit the elusive 20k. But that's it. No removal effects, no other beaters, it's king or nothing. Where's your crown? Let's just say this is a 5, but with so many footnotes. Talking about recovery, with a deck that aims to go all out in one turn such as this one, usually just means referring to their graveyard extenders, but Skull Servants can theoretically bounce back to where they want to be pretty easily in case they whiff the initial swing. Just banish a White Lord or White Prince and you're back in the game. All you need is a filled graveyard, no extensive field setup or anything. Again, it's good, but exclusively in favor of one monster, which is why it would feel weird to give it the same grade as something that clearly has a lot more going on. This is a 3? But in a different color. My grading process has so much integrity. Protection exists in the form of Lady and White Baking. Neither a particularly bad form of it, even though one is rarely on the field for it to apply, and the latter usually gets discarded for the search. This is like a normal 2. Lastly, Skull Servant's versatility is an interesting point, because while the deck does exactly one thing on its own, it does it in such a way that it can be splashed with a handful of other decks for some fun variants. Lightsworn, Zombie Synchro, or Horus all gel pretty comfortably with the amount of floating and graveyard setup involved, so while the deck has a very linear game plan, it's just flexible enough for a bit of build variety. That's a 2. Here's a mostly pure deck list with things to help them hit the graveyard and have a bit more field presence. Not gonna lie, the Link Kuriboh ban was rough for this extra deck, but what do? You could also use them with Tear Laments, but just the thought of it makes my stomach turn, so I personally won't. What a weird, cute little series. On all accounts, Skull Servants have remained as much of a gimmick deck as they used to be, but the gimmick in question is so over the top that you can hardly fault people for sticking with it. Everybody loves funny skeletons, that's just a fact of life, so it makes you wonder if the deck would have ever gotten off the ground if it was instead based on like Caterpillar. No other archetype has really gotten the IV drip support treatment the way Skull Servants have, which is what makes it so interesting whenever they do get their singular new card in each era of the game that lets them keep up just a little bit more. At this point, it would almost be weird if they got a full support wave, although I guess I could see it with a sprinkling of back row, or maybe a Skulldog Maron retrain. But right now, it's a simple and fun deck with just enough of a unique spin to stay fresh whenever it reappears. Because no matter how you do it, everyone loves seeing a huge boner. I had to do it once.
Well, hey everyone, it's the channeled spirit of Ojamaline here. I'd just like to say that
Well, wow. First, I'd like to say these robes are kind of stylish. You know, I've always been mostly naked for most of my time, so having this much of my body covered up is kind of making me feel a certain way. Anyway, I just wanted to wish you all a happy New Year and the other holidays. And I just wanted to reassure everyone that even though I'm dead, ow.
This sucks.
Even though I'm dead, ow.
I wanna go home.
Even though I'm dead, I'll probably be back within a couple turns or so. I mean, you know how this game. Ow! Why are you hitting me?
We were supposed to go to Skeleton World.
Is this not Skeleton World? Look at this place.
This is Skeleton Land, Dad. I hate you. I wanna go live with Mom.
Son, I don't know how to tell you this, but I think your mom's dead.
Yeah? So are you.
Oh yeah, that's right.
That's it. I'm running away from home.
Thanks, kid. Good luck with your father.
Sonny, I got you the worms. Son?
Hey, Dad.